Our project is over sexual exploitation with a concentration in women by Franco Bejarona, Samantha Butler, Kristen Consuegra, and Kathy Diaz.
Day and night.
Prostitution and sex trafficking have two very different definitions. Prostitution is the business or practice of engaging in sexual relations in exchange for payment, where sex trafficking is a violation of human rights. At any given moment, there are 40 million prostitutes at work. That's more than the population of Australia and Canada. Prostitution is completely legal and regulated in 22 countries. Japan and Thailand have the most profits from prostitution. Japan makes $27 billion a year, and Thailand makes $35 billion a year. In America, 80,000 citizens are arrested a year for soliciting sex. Sex trafficking is the fastest growing criminal industry in the world, making about $58 billion a year, just behind the cocaine industry. The average age for a female prostitute is 14 years old. 75 to 95% of prostitutes are abused as a child, and 92% of prostitutes say they want to leave prostitution but can't due to lack of money or food. Rape is another piece of sexual exploitation that I would like to discuss. 91% of rape victims are women. Rape is the most underreported violent crime in America. Only 16% of rapes are ever reported to the police, and a rape is reported every 5 minutes. 2% of rapists are convicted and imprisoned. 1.3 women, ages 18 and over in the United States, are forcibly raped every minute. The social challenges can be fighting the perception of others, the stereotype that it is a choice, and the negative label that is associated with sexual exploitation. The consequences of sexual exploitation can be contracting sexually transmitted diseases, pregnancy, psychological damages, physical damage, and murder are some of the consequences of the world of sexual exploitation.
There is a high commonness of adults that are submitted to sexual abuse that survive sexual abuse as a child. Although this is a significant risk factor, there are others that prove equally as important. Economic disparities, gender, childhood hardships, foregoing psychopathologies, and caretaker psychopathology may all play a role in increasing the risk of sexual abuse in adults. Research does show that risk factors vary depending on the population that is sampled. However, it is fairly clear that marital status, lack of social support, and unemployment have also been found to contribute to sexual assault in adults. Unfortunately, the non-solicited sexual experience does not end after the assault is over. Many survivors deal with rape trauma syndrome, PTSD, and substance use coping. Rape trauma syndrome is a psychological theory that can be identified through a number of stages, which include acute stage, outer adjustment stage, and renormalization stage. The acute stage may be represented by diminished alertness, numbness, dulled sensory, debilitating anxiety, an obsession with cleaning themselves, and pronounced internal tremor. The outward adjustment stage is seen when survivors to resume their life as it was before the assault. 5 main coping strategies may be demonstrated during this time: minimization, dramatization, suppression, explanation, and flight. The renormalization stage is when the survivor is able to distinguish their adjustment phase. Studies show that adult survivors have more psychiatric treatment than most because of their higher risk of depression, anxiety, and substance coping mechanisms. They are also more likely to have sexually transmitted diseases in comparison to someone that has not been a victim of sexual abuse. Family plays a crucial part of sexual abuse. Oftentimes, secrecy is a cultural norm within family structures. Victims of abuse within the family oftentimes feel ashamed and are unable to seek help because of the cultural standards of the family. A more serious subject within family is the concept of incest, defined as sexual relations between family members. Victims of incest find themselves in unique, conflicting, and difficult situations, having to deal with not only emotional trauma, but also the violation of trust and the consequences of reporting the case. The victim might feel pressured by other family members not to report the crime in order to protect the aggressor from criminal or ethical consequences.
Ethically, feminist theory tells us that in our male-dominated society, we should acknowledge that women live in disadvantage. Ethical turnaround for adult victims of sexual abuse came during the women's movement of 1974. Rape trauma syndrome came to establish guidelines for recognition and management of this traumatic psychological event. It established a logical sequence of the victim's shame, self-blame, and secrecy, which can easily camouflage the attack. Ethically, this theory contributes to a sympathetic reception of rape victims in both clinics and courts. Rape trauma syndrome opened a whole new legal framework in working with victims of sexual abuse. Victims that would have otherwise been at a disadvantage now have a better chance of fighting for justice because rape trauma explains the circumstances that women likely flee to after events like rape, self-victimization, evidence removal, and silence about the trauma. Biological factors that contribute to the severity and frequency of female victims of sexual abuse are those concerning how women perceive and respond to traumatic events. Women's minds are diverse compared to males, which can lead to many distinct factors concerning trauma. The study, Rethinking the Gender Gap, discusses how gender is a social construct specifying the socially prescribed roles or attributes assigned to men and women that influence trauma assessments. Experiences may lead women to feel as though they lack control and independence, which can result in a thinking pattern that increases probability women will interpret a traumatic event as threatening and uncontrollable, as well as undermines self-efficacy and ability to cope with distress. Studies have shown that women, compared to men, overestimate how long a traumatic event lasts and are more likely to view traumatic experiences as threatening, scary, and bad related to other things that have happened in their lives. Women also underestimate the probability of danger and focus attention on negative interpretations and outcome expectations.
A universal recurring cultural factor is the concept of victim blaming. By definition, victim blaming is the action of placing the blame, either partially or fully, on victims of a crime, making them responsible for whatever outcome has fallen onto them. Victim blaming is seen on victims of sexual abuse. Adult female victims are particularly vulnerable to victim blaming. By criticizing the way women dress or alleging to some kind of promiscuity, victim blaming serves the purpose of justifying sexual abuse. According to feminist theory, because we live in a male-dominated society, cultural factors that antagonize women have developed in order to justify male sexual aggression. The theory claims that people are motivated to justify and rationalize the way things are, and so things like victim blaming find themselves popular not only in society but also in the human psyche. Another cultural factor that plays into sexual abuse is sexual objectification, which is defined as a treatment of a person as an instrument of sexual pleasure, thus becoming a sex object. Sexual objectification of women is seen in everyday life such as advertisements, TV, movies, magazines, music, and pretty much all kinds of media. Adult female women, especially young adults, are most vulnerable to sexual objectification, as this is the age when biological differences between women and men become prominent. Finally, research demonstrates that sexual objectification of women leads to greater acceptance of victim blaming, which puts into perspective how cultural factors are intertwined and support the continuation of sexual abuse as a social problem. Social institutions also play a fundamental role in the sexual abuse of women. Universally and historically, rape and sexual abuse have been considered a criminal offense of minimal significance due to cultural factors, and in fact some cultures and religious denominations today do not view it as a crime. More recently, ever since the 1970s and 80s, the United States, Europe, and many other nations have implemented a more serious stand in favor of women by the use of evidence collection material known as rape kits. However, because police officers, lawyers, judges, and doctors might have their own preconceived notions about rape, oftentimes the victim finds herself discouraged or unable to seek help. For example, in the 2012 study done in several American small towns shows that 41% of the time, local law enforcement will not implement the protocol of collecting evidence when encountered with a claim of rape, on the basis that they believe the allegations to be false. A more serious example can be found in the American military. A 2003 study estimated that about 1,900 cases of sexual assault happen in the military every year, out of which only 6% get reported and only 3% make it to court. In fact, women in the military are more likely to be raped than to die in combat. Finally, another institution that is heavily involved in sexual abuse is marriage. Spousal rape was not declared a human right violation until 1993, and in fact it remains legal in many countries in Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia.
In conclusion, we aim to incorporate two theoretical perspectives within this presentation. With rape trauma syndrome, we build a biological and psychological framework of why a victim of sexual abuse might behave a certain way, creating self-victimization, confusion, or the need to remove evidence. In feminist theory, we seek to define sociocultural factors as the result of being a male-dominant society, creating an environment that is inherently hostile towards women. Biologically, females perceive and respond differently to traumatic events, making situations of sexual exploitation more problematic than that of a male. Psychologically, adult survivors of abuse may suffer from struggles ranging from PTSD to acute anxiety. Culturally, women are subject to stigma regarding sexual abuse with concepts like victim blaming and sexual exploitation. Culture and psychological factors can also trickle down to the family unit. Creating a family environment is dismissed or kept in secret. Social institutions also often add to the continuation of sexual abuse by playing fundamental roles within society. Institutions like the military, marriage, and law enforcement create an environment where sexual abuse can thrive. On a micro level, recommendations for social work practice in dealing with victims of sexual assault is realizing that abuse has a real biological and psychological effect of individuals that not always work in the favor. It is a trauma. Secondarily, on a macro level, by realizing that abuse on women is oftentimes the result of social injustice, one can build a framework within communities and policy change.